It's October, and a moving truck is idling outside a stucco house in Sarasota, Florida. The lawn is perfect, the pool is turquoise. A for sale sign has been standing in that yard for 140 days. 3 years ago, a house like this one would have sold in a weekend in a bidding war sight unseen to a retiree from Ohio or Ontario who'd been dreaming about this exact street for a decade. Today, the sign is still there, and it's not just this house or this street. Across the states that built their entire identity around welcoming retirees, Florida, Arizona, Texas, Nevada, something has quietly shifted. The migration pattern that defined American retirement for 50 years is showing its first real cracks, and the data behind those cracks is now too large to ignore. For most of your life, if someone asked you where Americans go to retire, the answer wrote itself. You go south. You go where it's warm, where there's no state income tax, where the golf courses stay green in January and the winters simply don't happen. Millions of people built their entire financial plan around this idea: sell the house up north, buy something bigger and cheaper down south, live better on less. It wasn't a rumor, it was backed by real numbers for decades, and it's part of why we've spent so much time on this channel looking at exactly these places. But somewhere between 2023 and now, the story that has held for half a century started to bend. Not all at once, and not because of one dramatic headline. It's a slow, data-confirmed shift, showing up in census figures, in housing inventory, in international travel statistics, in a set of numbers most people planning their retirement have never seen. This isn't a video telling you to panic, and it isn't a video telling you the Sun Belt is finished. It's a documentary built entirely on verified data, Census Bureau migration figures, state-level inflow and outflow numbers, a cost analysis from Fidelity Investments, travel statistics from Statistics Canada, insurance market filings from Florida's own regulator, hospital risk data from healthcare policy researchers, and a 15 million move study published in early 2026, walking through exactly what's changing, why it's changing, and what it actually means if you are one of the millions of Americans still planning that move south. By the end, you'll understand not whether to go, but what questions the data says you should be asking before you do. Let's start with the number that got demographers' attention this year. Between July 2024 and July 2025, the United States added just 1.78 million people. The year before, it added 3.2 million, nearly double. That's the slowest population growth the country has logged in years, and the primary driver wasn't people dying or people leaving. It was a 54% collapse in net international migration, which fell from 2.7 million people down to 1.3 million. Why does that matter for retirement towns in Florida and Arizona? Because for the last decade, a huge share of Sun Belt population growth wasn't retirees moving in from Michigan or Illinois. It was a combination of retirees and new immigrants filling service jobs, construction crews, and healthcare positions that keep retirement communities running. When that second engine slows down by more than half, the whole growth machine that Sunbelt towns were built around starts running on one cylinder instead of two. And the retiree engine itself is cooling too. Not stopping, but cooling in a way the raw numbers make hard to argue with. Take Florida, the single biggest retirement magnet in the country. In 2023, the state took in 637,000 people from other states. Sounds enormous until you look at the other side of the ledger. 511,000 people left Florida that same year, the largest outflow the state has ever recorded. Net gain, once you do that math, was 126,000 people. That's a 50% drop from the year before. Texas tells a similar story. Inflows of 612,000, outflows of 480,000, a net gain of 132,000, still the largest net gain of any state, but down 41% from 2022. These aren't small statistical wobbles. These are the two biggest retirement and relocation states in the country, both showing the exact same pattern. More people are leaving than we're used to seeing, and fewer new people are arriving to replace them. But the number that should really stop you, The one that turns this from a slowdown into something closer to a reversal comes from a study published in February 2026 that tracked nearly 15 million moves across all of 2025. That study found Florida's net retiree migration, meaning specifically people aged 60 and older, had shrunk to just 815 people for the entire year, not 126,000, 815, for a state that has spent decades as the undisputed number one retirement destination in the country, sometimes pulling in 3 times as many senior residents as the next closest state. That number is the clearest single sign in this entire documentary that something structural has changed, not just slowed down. Part of the explanation sits in the same 2026 cost of living rankings. Florida, the state that built its brand on being affordable, fell to 31st in the nation for cost of living in the first quarter of 2026, dragged down by housing, insurance, and utility costs that have climbed faster than almost anywhere else. There's a reason this matters more for retirees specifically than for the general population, and it comes down to something demographers at places like the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and the Wisconsin School of Business have been tracking closely. Age actually changes the math. Younger movers in their 20s and 30s are still chasing jobs and are relatively insensitive to small shifts in cost of living. Retirees are the opposite. They live on a fixed income, they're more sensitive to property tax changes, insurance premium spikes, and the price of the home itself, and critically, they're mobile enough to move again if the math stops working, but not so mobile that they'll do it lightly, which is exactly why the housing data, city by city, is where this story gets concrete. Start with Phoenix, Arizona, the classic Sunbelt retirement magnet. During the pandemic years, home prices in the Phoenix metro climbed at a pace nobody expected. Remote workers and retirees were both chasing the same warm weather, low density lifestyle, and prices responded exactly the way you'd expect a market to respond to a demand shock, hard and fast. But the reversal has been just as visible. As inventory increased and mortgage rates climbed, that price growth didn't just slow. In several segments, it went slightly negative. Sellers who 3 years ago could name their price are now the ones negotiating. Homes are sitting on the market longer. And here's the detail that matters most for our purposes. Phoenix's retirement age population actually grew slightly slower than the national average between 2018 and 2023, 12.7% versus 13.1% nationally, while home prices in the metro rose considerably faster than that. In plain terms, the retirees weren't the ones driving the price spike, but they're the ones now living with the correction. Las Vegas followed an almost identical arc, just with sharper edges. Nevada has no state income tax, which has made it one of the most heavily marketed retirement destinations of the last decade. Prices surged through 2021 and 2022 as remote workers and investors piled in alongside retirees. Then mortgage rates climbed, investment buying cooled, and the market softened in a way that's now visible in listing data across the metro: more inventory, longer time on market, sellers willing to negotiate in ways they simply weren't 2 years ago. Now let's go to Naples, Florida, because Naples is the single clearest case study in this whole documentary, and the numbers here are exact rather than approximate. Over the 3 months ending May 2026, Naples home prices were down 10.4% compared to the same period the year before, with a median sale price of $1.3 million, and homes now take an average of 83 days to sell. During the pandemic boom, Naples home prices had surged 74% between December 2019 and June 2022, nearly double the national increase of 42% over that same window, which is exactly why analysts now describe it as one of the most overvalued markets in the country heading into its correction. And there's a detail buried in Redfin's own migration data that tells you something the price chart alone can't. In the first quarter of 2026, 40% of people searching for homes in Naples were actually searching to move out of the metro entirely, not into it. For a city whose entire economy is built on the assumption that wealthy retirees only move in, never out, that's a meaningful crack in the foundation. Orlando shows what analysts are calling one of the most balanced corrections anywhere in the Sunbelt. Not a crash, but a clear stabilization after years of pandemic speed appreciation, with some neighborhoods actually posting small year over year declines, concentrated in the mid tier housing that most retirees are shopping in. The engine that drew people to Orlando in the first place, entertainment, medical infrastructure, rental demand, hasn't disappeared. But the price momentum that made buying there feel urgent has clearly broken. None of this means these markets are collapsing in the way a headline might want you to believe. What it means, and what the data supports without needing to be dramatized, is that the assumption baked into decades of retirement planning that Sunbelt real estate only goes up, that buying in now beats waiting, no longer holds the way it used to. If you're one of the people who's been sitting on the fence about a Sunbelt move, this is actually useful news. The pressure to act immediately, the buy before it's too late urgency that so much retirement content pushes, is not what the current data supports. Let's move west for a moment, because Arizona's version of this story has a detail Florida's doesn't. For the first time in years, more retirees are actually leaving the state than the headline top destination ranking suggests. In 2025, Texas saw 18,923 older adults leave the state, and Arizona recorded 15,454 outbound moves among the same age group. At the same time, Tucson still pulled in 7,627 retirement age arrivals, enough to rank it among the top 3 retirement destination cities in the entire country, just behind Las Vegas at 7,854. Read those two numbers together, and you get the real picture. Arizona and Texas are both still net winners in the retiree migration game, but the gap between people arriving and people leaving has narrowed enough that a state which used to be an obvious, uncomplicated yes now requires the same city by city, budget by budget scrutiny that used to be reserved for the riskier destinations. Tucson itself illustrates why some retirees are choosing it over Phoenix specifically. Housing there runs 17 to 35% cheaper than Phoenix, and it carries lower exposure to the kind of extreme heat and monsoon season insurance spikes that have started reshaping the conversation around Arizona's biggest metro. But Tucson's own local job market grew just 0.1% in 2024 and 2025. A reminder that a retirement destination cooling off economically isn't automatically a warning sign for retirees themselves, since their income usually doesn't depend on the local job market the way a younger mover's does. Texas deserves its own moment here too, because the pressure there doesn't come from hurricanes and insurance the way it does in Florida. It comes from property tax. Texas has no state income tax, which is the headline every retirement guide leads with, but the state makes up a meaningful share of that revenue through property taxes that run well above the national average, and those bills are based on home value, which means the same pandemic-era price surges that inflated Naples also inflated property tax bills across Texas retirement hotspots. A retiree living on a fixed income doesn't get the luxury of a rising home value helping with the monthly budget the way a working buyer might. They just see the tax bill go up every year, regardless of whether they ever plan to sell. That's part of why Texas's 18,923 outbound retirees in 2025 matters as much as the inbound number does. It's not that Texas stopped being a low-tax state, it's that low tax and affordable to live in on a fixed income turned out to be two different questions, and a growing number of retirees are doing the math and finding they don't line up the way the marketing promised. Now, here's a piece of this story that almost nobody outside of Florida and Arizona's tourism boards has been paying attention to, and it might be the single most underappreciated economic thread in this entire documentary. The Canadians are staying home. Every October, for as long as most of us can remember, hundreds of thousands of Canadian retirees have packed up and headed south to Florida, Arizona, Texas, and the Carolinas, swapping snow for sunshine in a migration so reliable that entire local economies were built to expect it. A November 2025 survey of more than 4,000 Snowbird Advisor members found that 70% of Canadian snowbirds spend their winters in the United States, and roughly half of them own property here outright. These aren't casual tourists. Restaurants, golf clubs, fitness centers, landscaping companies, property management firms, and seasonal home healthcare providers across the Sun Belt all expand their staffing every November specifically to meet this demand, then contract again every April. In the towns where snowbird density is highest, this seasonal cycle isn't a footnote in the local economy. It's a load-bearing wall, and according to Statistics Canada, that wall started cracking last year. Canadian return trips from the United States fell 25.4% in 2025, down to 29.1 million trips. Early 2026 data showed no sign of a rebound. In fact, February 2026 return trips were down a further 14.5% year over year, according to Statistics Canada's own March 2026 release. This is not a one-month blip, it's two consecutive data points confirming the same direction, which is exactly the kind of pattern that turns a possible trend into a real one. What's driving it is a combination of factors that, individually, might not have moved the needle, but together have clearly added up. A weaker Canadian dollar making every dollar spent in the US more expensive, new and stricter cross-border registration requirements that add friction to what used to be an easy annual trip, rising cross-border tensions that have made some Canadian retirees simply uncomfortable, and a broader reassessment among near retirees of whether the traditional snowbird plan still makes financial sense. Most snowbirds fall between the ages of 60 and 80, which is to say they're either already retired or planning their retirement around this exact lifestyle, and their decisions are a leading indicator for what a huge slice of the retirement demographic is thinking. For towns like Inglewood, Florida, or Sun City West, Arizona, places that follow an almost clockwork annual rhythm, quiet in October, packed by January, a sustained drop in snowbird arrivals doesn't show up as a dramatic news event. It shows up as slightly fewer diners at the same restaurants, slightly softer demand at the same golf courses, seasonal workers whose hours get trimmed instead of expanded. It's the kind of change that's easy to miss if you're only glancing at headline population numbers, and exactly the kind of change that shows up clearly once you start pulling the actual travel and economic data. Let's bring in the next thread now, because this piece is the one that might reshape how you think about the financial case for moving south in the first place. And it comes from a source that has no reason to spin the story one way or the other: Fidelity Investments. The traditional Sunbelt pitch is simple and it's repeated everywhere. Sell the house, move south, no state income tax, lower cost of living, done. Roughly 300,000 retirement-age Americans make exactly this move to a Sunbelt state every year, according to Census Bureau data, with more than a third of them choosing Florida alone. But a sweeping new cost analysis from Fidelity is asking retirees to slow down and actually run the full numbers before assuming the math works the way it always has. The finding, in plain terms, is that taxes, insurance, and property costs in Sunbelt states can offset, sometimes almost entirely, the benefit of paying no state income tax. Fidelity's hypothetical comparisons make this concrete. A married couple relocating from Colorado to Nevada would save roughly $4,000 a year in combined taxes and insurance. That's real money, and it supports part of the traditional story. But that same couple moving instead to Arizona or to California would save only about $2,000 a year, half as much once you factor in the full cost picture rather than just the income tax line. The pattern flips entirely depending on where you're starting from. The math works best for people leaving a genuinely high-cost, high-tax state. For retirees already living somewhere reasonably affordable, the picture can reverse completely and the promised savings can shrink to almost nothing once property insurance premiums, which have climbed sharply across hurricane-exposed states, are added to the ledger. The Florida insurance story is worth walking through in full here because it's actually more complicated and more interesting than a simple story of costs going up forever. It's a story in two acts. In the first act, roughly 2021 through 2024, the market genuinely fell apart. More than 20 private insurance carriers pulled out of Florida entirely, went bankrupt, or stopped writing new policies, citing hurricane losses, soaring reinsurance costs, and years of litigation. Homeowners who lost coverage had nowhere to go except Citizens Property Insurance, the state-backed insurer of last resort, which ballooned from a few 100,000 policies to a peak of roughly 1.4 million policies in October 2023. The average Florida premium climbed to over $8,000 a year in some 2025 industry reports, nearly 3 times the national average, and coastal counties like Monroe averaged even higher than that. But the second act, which is unfolding right now in 2026, is a genuine turn, and leaving it out would make this documentary just as one-sided as the buy now before it's too late content we're trying to correct. Florida's 2022 and 2023 legal reforms, which cut down on the litigation that had been driving costs up, are starting to show results. 18 new private insurers have entered the Florida market since those reforms. Citizens has shrunk from its 1.4 million policy peak down to roughly 336,000 policies by early 2026, a 76% reduction, as private companies took back the risk they'd abandoned a few years earlier. For the first time since 2015, Citizens itself filed for a rate decrease, an average of 8.7% statewide, starting at spring 2026 renewals, with reductions over 10% for more than 150,000 policyholders. State Farm filed for a 10.1% statewide decrease. Several other major carriers filed decreases too. None of this erases the fact that Florida still has the most expensive home insurance in the country, and coastal, older roof properties in high-risk counties are still going to see premiums that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. But it does mean the insurance side of this story isn't a one-way ratchet upward the way it looked in 2023 and 2024. It's a market that broke, got expensive enough to force real legislative change, and is now, slowly, beginning to correct the same basic pattern we've already seen play out in the housing market itself. What this means practically for anyone weighing a Florida purchase in 2026 is that the number you should care about isn't a headline average. It's the actual quote for the actual property, because the same home can price wildly differently depending on roof age, wind mitigation features, and distance from the coast, sometimes by a factor of 3 or more between carriers for an identical house. Getting that quote before making an offer, not after, has gone from a nice to have to a genuine requirement in Florida's current market. And on top of the base homeowners policy, condo buyers face association fees that have climbed sharply following new structural inspection requirements that swept the industry after a well-known building collapse in South Florida. And those fees, plus the special assessments that sometimes follow a failed inspection, can add thousands of dollars a year to what looked on paper like an affordable condo purchase. Housing entry costs tell part of this story too. A $175,000 retirement home is still findable in parts of Florida, but Fidelity raises the follow-up question almost nobody asks before signing. Is it in a walkable neighborhood, close to the healthcare access that becomes more important with every passing year? Condos offer a cheaper entry point across the Sun Belt, with average prices ranging from $213,000 in Louisiana up to $414,700 in Alabama. But those condo association fees we just walked through eat directly into whatever the no income tax headline promised to save you. None of this means the tax advantage is fake. For someone moving from New York, New Jersey, or California, states with genuinely high combined tax burdens, the Sun Belt math frequently still works, and works well. What the data actually shows is narrower and more useful than either extreme. The savings are real, but they're not automatic, and they depend entirely on where you're moving from, what kind of property you're buying, and how exposed that property is to the specific cost pressures, insurance in Florida, property tax in Texas, that have been reshaping retiree budgets faster than almost any other line item. That question about healthcare access Fidelity raised earlier deserves its own full section, because it connects to something happening well beyond insurance premiums. And it's especially relevant if you've ever been drawn to the kind of small, hidden town that promises a lower cost of living away from the big metro areas. A January 2026 analysis from the Center for Healthcare Quality and Payment Reform found that 734 rural hospitals across the United States, roughly 1/3 of every rural hospital in the country, are now at risk of closure due to severe financial problems, with 309 of those facing immediate risk. This isn't a new problem, but it's an accelerating one. Since 2005, 192 rural hospitals nationwide have either closed outright or converted to a model that no longer offers full inpatient care, and Texas alone accounts for 25 of those closures, more than any other state, with Tennessee and North Carolina close behind. Financial strain, thin patient volumes, and heavy reliance on Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement in exactly the kind of small towns that retirement content, including content on this channel, often recommends as hidden gems, are the primary drivers. Reduced federal reimbursement rates taking effect through 2026 are expected to add further pressure, specifically in rural, Medicaid-dependent facilities across the Deep South. None of this means small towns should be off the table. Plenty of the destinations we've covered on this channel are perfectly served by a nearby regional hospital and don't carry meaningful risk. But it does mean that quiet, affordable, off the beaten path, and reliable emergency care 20 minutes away aren't automatically the same thing, and for a retiree, proximity to functioning healthcare tends to matter more with every passing year, not less. Before falling in love with a small town specifically for its low prices and its distance from crowds, it's worth checking whether the nearest hospital is financially stable, because a town's affordability can look very different once you factor in a 40-minute drive to the nearest emergency room, or the possibility that the hospital that exists today doesn't exist in 5 years. We're now several data threads into this documentary, and each one points in the same direction independently. Slower migration, a collapsed net retiree gain in Florida specifically, cooling housing markets from Phoenix to Naples, a shrinking snowbird economy, a genuinely volatile insurance market that's only now stabilizing, rising property tax pressure in Texas, a real risk to rural healthcare access in exactly the small towns that retirement content tends to favor, and a modest but real outflow of retirees from Texas and Arizona. None of these threads depend on the others to be true. They come from completely different sources: the Census Bureau, Statistics Canada, Fidelity Investments, Redfin and Zillow's own market data, Florida's own insurance regulator, healthcare policy researchers, and the 15 million move study from February 2026, and they all converge on the same conclusion. So, if the traditional Sunbelt is losing some of its grip, where is that momentum actually going? This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the answer isn't just nowhere or everyone stays put. It's a specific sourced migration into a part of the country that spent 30 years being treated as the place people leave, not the place people move to. The Carolinas are the clearest example, and Charlotte specifically tells a story that runs almost in the opposite direction of Naples. According to the same February 2026 study that tracked those 15 million moves, states that used to be afterthoughts on every retirement list, Wyoming, the Carolinas, Tennessee, are now holding their own against Florida or beating it outright in national retirement rankings. North Carolina gained more than 84,000 new residents in the 2025 census estimates, the most of any state in the country, and South Carolina wasn't far behind with just over 66,000, growing at 1.5%, the fastest rate in the nation. A meaningful share of that inflow is what demographers have started calling baby chasers, boomers following their adult children and grandchildren who moved to Charlotte for work, and most of that specific migration has concentrated right there in the Charlotte metro. The financial case backs it up too. North Carolina doesn't tax Social Security at all, and its flat income tax rate on other retirement income is scheduled to drop to 3.99% in 2026, down from 4.25% the year before, a state that US News ranked Charlotte 9th and Raleigh 6th among the best cities in the country to retire. But even Charlotte, the beneficiary in this story, isn't immune to the same forces reshaping the Sun Belt. Between July 2024 and July 2025, the Charlotte region saw 135 people move in each day, down 14% from 157 the year before, the first decline the metro has recorded in 6 years, and the steepest single-year drop the 16-county region has seen in 16 years, excluding the pandemic itself. The cause tracks almost exactly with what's been slowing Sunbelt growth nationwide: a sharp pullback in international migration, which is a meaningful piece of population growth even in a domestic migration success story like Charlotte. The takeaway here isn't that Charlotte is failing. It's still growing faster than almost anywhere else in the country. The takeaway is that no single city, Sunbelt or otherwise, is fully insulated from the national forces we've walked through in this documentary. Even the winners are growing more slowly than they were 3 years ago. Now, for the piece of this story that very few retirement channels are willing to touch directly because it's the slowest moving and hardest to measure: heat. The Sunbelt's entire pitch is built on climate, warm winters, no snow, year round outdoor living. But the same warming trend that made winters in Phoenix and Orlando famously mild is now pushing summers into territory that changes the calculation for an aging population. Extreme heat days have been increasing faster in the hottest regions of the country than almost anywhere else. And for retirees, a demographic more vulnerable to heat-related health risks than almost any other age group, that's not an abstract climate statistic. It's a lived, daily life consideration that shows up in higher cooling bills, more days spent indoors during what used to be the good months, and for a growing number of people, a genuine reconsideration of whether the place they plan to retire is still the place they want to retire. This is part of what's quietly reshaping the other side of the map. For decades, the assumption has run one direction only: people leave the Northeast and Midwest for the Sunbelt. Full stop, end of story. But the Census Bureau data from the most recent migration cycle tells a noticeably more complicated version of that story. The Sunbelt's pull is weakening in some metros while strengthening in others. And this is the part that would have sounded almost absurd a decade ago. The Midwest is quietly becoming a destination in its own right. Cities like Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Madison, and Minneapolis, places that spent the better part of 30 years on the losing end of every migration statistic in the country, are now seeing renewed interest from a mix of remote workers, younger professionals, and, increasingly, retirees looking to escape both the rising home prices and the rising temperatures of the traditional Sunbelt. Buffalo is being cited for its combination of genuinely affordable housing and a revitalized downtown. Pittsburgh is drawing attention for growing healthcare infrastructure, which matters enormously to retirees, paired with home prices well below the national median. Minneapolis is pulling in people for its livability and green space. On the rental side, the shift shows up even more starkly. Milwaukee, Chicago, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Detroit, and Kansas City are now among the top 10 metro areas in the entire country for year-over-year rent growth, a list that, 5 years ago, would have been dominated almost entirely by Sunbelt cities. Lower migration into the old Sunbelt boomtowns is translating directly into more housing inventory and softer prices there, while resilient, stable demand in a handful of Midwest metros is doing the exact opposite. It's also worth noting that healthcare infrastructure in these Midwest cities is generally built around large, established urban hospital systems rather than smaller rural facilities, which sidesteps much of the closure risk we just walked through for small Sunbelt towns. There's also a lesser-known thread inside Arizona itself worth mentioning here, because it shows the same instinct playing out even among people who aren't leaving the broader region. A growing number of Arizona retirees have started looking at Wyoming instead of staying in the state, drawn by a cost of living index close to the national average versus Arizona's own, combined with a state and local tax burden that ranks first in the country for tax competitiveness. It's a small trend compared to the Midwest story, but it fits the same pattern. Retirees who used to treat their Sunbelt state as a permanent, uncomplicated decision are now shopping the full picture: taxes, insurance, healthcare access, climate, cost of living, the way they'd shop any other major purchase. There's also a detail in the demographic research that adds real nuance to this entire migration story, and it comes from researchers studying senior migration specifically. Among Americans aged 85 and up, there's measurable evidence of people reversing their original retirement move and going back to where they came from. Younger retirees, in the 65 to 84 range, still show a clear net gain into Arizona and Florida. But some traditionally non-Sunbelt states, Colorado, Minnesota, Virginia, and Washington, actually show a net loss in that 65 to 84 bracket, paired with a net gain in residents 85 and older. Read together, that's a pattern worth sitting with. The The Sunbelt move that looks right at 68 doesn't always look right at 88. Once healthcare proximity, family distance, and daily mobility become the priorities that outweigh a warm winter, it's worth putting all of these threads together in one place, because on their own, each one sounds like a manageable, individually solvable problem. Insurance premiums are stabilizing. Housing inventory is up, which favors buyers. Property taxes in Texas are a known, budgetable cost. Rural hospitals are a risk you can research before you buy, not an automatic deal breaker. Any single one of these taken alone is the kind of thing a careful retiree could plan around without much trouble. What changes the picture is that all of them are landing in the same states, sometimes the same counties, at roughly the same time, on top of a housing market correction and a genuine reversal in net retiree migration. A retiree evaluating Naples in 2026 isn't just weighing a slightly softer housing market. They're weighing that market alongside insurance costs that, even after this year's rate cuts, remain nearly 3 times the national average, alongside a state that saw its net senior migration collapse to under 1,000 people, alongside a summer heat season that keeps getting longer. None of those facts individually would justify walking away from a Sunbelt retirement. Together, they justify treating the decision with the same seriousness most people already bring to choosing a mortgage or a Medicare plan. It helps to picture 3 different retirees looking at 3 different moves, using nothing but the numbers already on the table in this documentary. The first is a couple leaving New Jersey for coastal Florida, drawn by the same pitch that's worked for 50 years. On paper, the no-income tax advantage is real and meaningful for them specifically, since New Jersey's combined tax burden is high enough that even Fidelity's own hypothetical math favors the move. But if they're looking at Naples or a comparable Gulf Coast market, they're buying into a metro where prices are already down over 10% from last year, where 40% of local searchers are looking to leave rather than arrive, and where an insurance quote, not a listing price, should be the first number they ask for, since identical homes in the same county have priced 3 times apart between carriers. For this couple, the math likely still works, but only if they run it property by property instead of trusting the state-level reputation. The second is a couple leaving Ohio for a small town in Texas, chasing the same no-income tax pitch, but with a very different budget reality once they arrive. Texas makes up for that missing income tax with property taxes well above the national average, taxes that climbed alongside the same pandemic-era price surge that inflated markets everywhere else in the Sun Belt, and that keep rising with home values, regardless of whether this couple ever plans to sell. If the small town they've picked also happens to sit near one of the 734 rural hospitals now flagged as financially at risk, the true cost of that move includes a healthcare access question that a simple side-by-side of state tax rates would never surface. 18,923 retirees left Texas in 2025 alone, and for at least some of them, this is likely the exact gap between the pitch and the reality that pushed them out. The third is a couple leaving Illinois, but instead of heading south, they are looking at Pittsburgh or Buffalo, the cities this documentary has flagged as the quiet beneficiaries of the Sun Belt's slowdown. They give up the guaranteed warm winter, and Illinois does tax retirement income in ways Florida and Texas don't, so their tax math looks less favorable on that one line. But they're buying into a market with genuinely affordable housing, a large urban hospital system instead of a rural facility at risk of closing, rent growth among the highest in the country, meaning the local economy is strengthening rather than softening, and none of the hurricane insurance volatility that's defined Florida ownership for the last 5 years. 3 couples, 3 completely different outcomes, and not one of them was well served by treating Sunbelt equals savings or Sunbelt equals risk as a rule rather than a starting point to verify. So where does all of this leave someone genuinely trying to decide where to retire in 2026, making one of the biggest financial decisions of their life and wanting the real picture instead of a sales pitch? The honest answer, built entirely from the data we've walked through, is not avoid the Sun Belt. Florida still took in far more new senior residents than any other state for most of the last 2 decades, and the fundamentals that made it attractive, no income tax, warm winters, extensive retirement infrastructure, haven't vanished overnight. What has changed is the certainty. The assumption that buying in the Sun Belt is a one-way bet that only appreciates, that snowbird economies will keep expanding forever, that the tax savings are automatic regardless of where you're moving from, that the climate will keep behaving the way it did in 1995, that small-town healthcare will always be there when you need it. Every one of those assumptions now has real, sourced, current data pushing back against it. And the fact that net retiree migration into Florida fell all the way to 815 people in a single year is not a detail you can explain away as noise. At the same time, it would be just as misleading to end this documentary on pure alarm. The Florida insurance market is actually improving in 2026, not collapsing further, which is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost when a story like this one gets flattened into a single headline. The real lesson isn't the Sun Belt is over, it's that every part of this decision, migration, housing prices, insurance, taxes, healthcare access, climate, is moving independently on its own timeline. And the only way to make a good decision in 2026 is to look at the current data for the specific place you're considering, not the reputation that place earned 5 or 10 years ago. If you're weighing this decision yourself, here's what actually follows from everything in this documentary, not as advice, but as the questions the data itself is raising. Before assuming a Sunbelt purchase saves you money, run the math yourself. Income tax savings minus the property tax and, critically, an actual insurance quote for that specific state, that specific county, that specific property, because the answer depends heavily on where you're moving from, not just where you're moving to. Before assuming prices will keep climbing, look at current inventory and days on market in the specific metro you're considering, because Phoenix, Naples, and Orlando are no longer the sellers' markets they were 3 years ago, and that shift benefits a patient buyer. Before falling for a small town's affordability, check on the financial health of the nearest hospital, since that's a number you can research just as easily as a school rating or a crime statistic. If you're drawn to a state specifically for the warm winters, it's worth weighing that against the summer reality too, since the same heat that used to be someone else's problem is increasingly showing up in cooling bills and in daily quality of life. And if healthcare access, extreme heat, and long term mobility matter to you as much as winter weather does, and for most people eventually they do, it's worth at least looking at the Carolinas or the Midwest cities that are quietly building the same kind of retirement infrastructure the Sun Belt built decades ago, often at a fraction of the current cost. The Sunbelt retirement dream isn't dead, but the version of it that existed 5 years ago, endless appreciation, an endless flow of snowbirds, a tax advantage that worked the same for everyone, regardless of circumstance, an insurance market that only ever got worse, small towns whose healthcare infrastructure could be taken for granted, that version is over, and the data confirms it from more independent directions than any single narrative could dismiss. What replaces it isn't a collapse. It's something more useful than the dream ever was. A market that finally rewards the people willing to look at the real numbers before they sign anything.